Okay, picture this. London, but silent. Eerily deserted. You remember those scenes from 28 Days Later, right? Cillian Murphy just stumbling through empty streets.
Oh yeah, absolutely chilling. That sort of tangible, everyday terror.
Exactly. And then, bam! March 2020 hits. Suddenly that dystopian vision felt, well, disturbingly real, didn't it?
It really did. Cities like London turning into actual ghost towns because of COVID.
It's uncanny. Where Murphy's character saw missing posters on Oxford Street, now there's that real memorial wall opposite Parliament for 200,000 people.
An incredibly sobering parallel. That line between fiction and our recent reality just blurred completely.
Completely. And that connection, that echo, is exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at the new film, 28 Years Later.
A return to that terrifying world Danny Boyle and Alex Garland created.
Yeah, and we've got some great insights. We're drawing from an exclusive interview with Boyle and one of the stars, Jodie Comer, plus some of those early reviews trickling out.
So our mission here, really, it isn't just to talk about a sequel. It's more about digging into the important stuff.
Right. How does art reflect life now, especially after everything we've been through globally?
And what are the deeper messages the filmmakers are trying to get across this time? We want to uncover those key nuggets about this new chapter.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. 28 Days Later, back in 2002, it hit hard.
It really did. That raw, visceral fear. Cillian Murphy, London landmarks totally empty because of the rage virus. It became instantly iconic imagery.
And the rage virus itself, the trigger was those chimps forced to watch violent footage, wasn't it?
That's right, a lab-created catalyst. And then, like you said, COVID arrives years later, and suddenly London is a ghost town for real.
It just amplifies the original horror. Danny Boyle actually talks about this, how audiences now find the terror more intense.
Because it feels more possible now.
Exactly. He says what used to feel like just movie stuff, well, now it hits closer to home after real global events.
And he points out the new film is really centered on how we adapted post-COVID, how we learned to function in this kind of unstable, vulnerable world.
So it's less about the initial shock and more about the long haul, the aftermath.
Precisely. It's about living with a threat decades later.
Okay, so how does that play out in the story itself? What's the setup for 28 Years Later?
Well, we jump forward, obviously, 28 years. The initial rage virus outbreak, the one we saw spread towards Europe in 28 weeks later, that's apparently been contained.
Contained how?
Pushed back, essentially.
Yeah.
The infected are now confined just to Britain. The UK is the quarantine zone, basically, while the rest of the world has supposedly moved on, healed.
Wow, so Britain's isolated. And that leads us to this specific setting, Holy Island.
Yeah, off the northeast coast of England. It's become this small sanctuary, about 150 survivors. They're living this sort of self-sufficient, almost feudal life.
Cut off.
Very cut off. Their only link to the mainland, which is still quarantined and dangerous, is this single causeway. Heavily defended, and you can only cross it at low tide.
That sounds incredibly precarious.
It creates this intense bubble of isolation. And that's where we meet the main characters.
Right, you've got the family, 12-year-old Spike, played by Alfie Williams.
His dad, Jamie, that's Aaron Taylor Johnson, and his mother, Isla, who's housebound, played by Jodie Comer.
And there's a generational thing happening too, isn't there? Between those who remember before and kids like Spike who've only known this world.
Absolutely, a huge gap.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of needs-must survival attitude that leads Jamie to take Spike over the causeway.
To the mainland, why?
Sort of a rite of passage for Spike's 12th birthday. A hunt. But things aren't that simple.
Because the infected haven't just stayed the same for 28 years.
Exactly. This is where it gets really interesting. The infected have evolved.
Evolved how? Like faster? Smarter?
Both, potentially. Some are described as crawling now, maybe more stealthy, but others have become alphas.
Alphas.
Yeah, leading these packs of fast-running infected. It suggests, a development, maybe even kind of hierarchy or intelligence. The rage virus didn't die down. It adapted. It grew.
That's terrifying.
And Boyle links this directly back to the COVID parallels. He observes how, over time, people start taking more risks.
Right, you test the boundaries, you see how far you can push things and still feel safe.
Which is a world away from the sheer panic of, 28 days after the infection. This is about long-term adaptation on both sides, human and virus.
And that adaptation, the human side of it, really leans on the actors' performances, I imagine.
Definitely. And Boyle chose to put a young character, Spike, right at the center.
Why a kid? Is it just that classic horror trope, innocence in peril?
Well, partly, maybe. But Boyle says it's more about exploring the truths adults tell children.
Or hide from them.
Exactly, the stories we construct to keep going, to protect them, maybe.
Jodie Comer plays Spike's mother, Isla. Did she connect with that theme?
She really did. She talked about her own parents, how they try to shield her from things. But she also said sometimes she wished they had shared more, because maybe she'd have acted differently. Though, she stressed it always came from love.
That's a really relatable conflict. And her character, Isla, sounds complex. She seems debilitated, but then has these moments of clarity.
Yeah, exactly. On the surface, she's unwell, maybe confused, but then she'll suddenly deliver a baby or fight off an infected attacker with this startling muscle memory.
Suggesting a past.
A past she's maybe not fully conscious of or is hidden. Comer said navigating those emotional shifts, the ebbs and flows of Isla, was the hardest part.
I can imagine. And what about facing the infected actors themselves? Comer mentioned that was quite an experience.
She called it thrilling. She talked about the film's gritty realism. Apparently no CGI, no green screen for the infected.
Really? So those are actors in makeup?
Hours in makeup. And she said they really go for it. They aren't taking the pace off. So you get these genuinely breathless, intense moments on set.
Wow. That commitment to realism definitely sounds like classic Boyle.
It does. And beyond the scares, he seems to be digging into bigger ideas again, like in his other films.
Yeah, Train Spotting, Slumdog Millionaire. They always have that social commentary layer. How does that come through here?
Well, he uses that relationship between Isla and Spike. He talks about showing different ways of progressing beyond just, quote, aggressive manhood.
So Spike learned something different from Isla.
Boyle suggests Spike becomes more fully armed in ways that aren't just about bows and arrows. It's about emotional intelligence, maybe. Resilience.
Comer mentioned something about hope through Spike too, didn't she?
Yeah, she sees an essence of hope through him and his curiosity. So it's not all bleak. That curiosity is presented as a strength.
Which contracts with the island's culture, maybe. Boyle described that as stagnant.
He did. He said he came back to horror because of an urgent political undercurrent. He sees the island sanctuary, this place looking back to the halcyon days of England, as regressive.
Deceptively safe, but stuck.
Exactly, not progressive. Standing still. And he links that directly to potential real-world horror.
Does putting such a direct political metaphor into a horror film work? Or does it feel, I don't know, a bit heavy?
That's always the risk, isn't it? Some critics felt it was a bit much, but Boyle defends it. He says putting it in horror is a good thing, because that kind of regression, he believes, will lead us to horror, and we know it will.
Strong words.
Yeah, he says we can see it beginning to happen even around us. For him, horror thrives on that feeling that massive, maybe terrible change is always possible, always lurking.
And he makes another really pointed comparison, doesn't he? Back to the original rage virus source.
He does. It's quite chilling. He connects those chimps forced to watch violent screens to the rise of social media today.
How so?
He points to algorithms designed to reward polarizing, rage-inducing content. He calls our phones incredibly powerful and easily manipulable, forcing us almost to interact through this lens of anger.
Wow. That's quite the parallel.
And then he contrasts that with cinema, with collective human experiences.
The antidote, maybe.
That seems to be the idea. He talks about the intangible but amazing quality of cinema, the authentic connection it offers. It's fragile, he says, but vital.
So the act of watching this film together, facing the terror as one, is part of the message itself.
That seems to be exactly his point. It's about shared experience pushing back against forces that try to divide and manipulate us through, well, rage.
It adds a whole other dimension to just going to see a zombie movie.
Absolutely.
So with all that going on, how are the critics reacting? What are the first reviews saying?
It's been pretty positive overall, actually. Robbie Collins at The Telegraph gave it 5 stars, called it Boyle's best film in years.
High praise.
Yeah, and Ed Potton at The Times also gave 5 stars.
Yeah.
Loved Comer's performance, said it might even be the best entry in the whole series.
Wow. But not universal acclaim.
Not entirely. Clarisse Laffrey at The Independent gave it 3 stars. She found it interesting, but felt the metaphors were maybe a bit too blunt, like being bonked on the head by the metaphor hammer.
Huh.
And Peter Bradshaw at The Guardian, also 3 stars, found the tone a little uncertain. So, mostly strong reviews, but a couple of critics weren't quite as convinced.
A fairly typical spread for a Boyle film, maybe. Always provokes a reaction.
Seems that way. And it looks like this is just the beginning. Boyle's confirmed it's planned as the first part of a new trilogy.
A trilogy, so Spike's story might continue.
Potentially across all 3 films, yes. And get this, the second film is already shot.
Already. Who directed that one?
Nia DaCosta directed it, Alex Garland wrote it again. It's apparently set for release next year.
So they're moving fast.
Very fast. And Boyle has said he plans to come back and direct the 3rd one himself, assuming it gets the green light.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big picture here? What's the main thing to take away from this deep dive into 28 years later?
I think it's clear this isn't just, more running zombies. It's very much a film holding up a mirror to our times.
Reflecting those post-pandemic anxieties, the political climate.
Exactly. Using that familiar horror framework to talk about some really deep human truths and where we might be heading as a society.
And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Boyle's comments about real versus imagined horror, the social media rage.
Definitely. It makes you ponder.
Yeah.
If a fictional virus can evolve like this, what about that real-world rage viruses he talks about? The algorithms, the division. How does that keep shaping us?
And maybe more importantly, what's the antidote? What are those authentic connections Boyle values so much, and how do you, listening now, fight to keep them alive in your own life?
That's the lingering question, isn't it? Food for thought long after the credits roll.